Добрий день, я вітаю всіх.
Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us at this press conference by Ukraine Media Center at Ukrinform. The war is raging on. Today we are seeing the 170th day of the full-scale aggression, and we appreciate all the efforts of those sharing the information about the heroic resistance of the Ukrainian people. At 13:30 we will have a head of the Donetsk Regional Military Civil Administration who will be talking about the situation in the Donetsk region. At this point, I would like to introduce our guest, Mr. Rostyslav Karandieiev, the first Deputy Minister of Culture and Information Policy of Ukraine. Today's topic is the law on ensuring the functioning of the English language as the language of international communication. Mr. Karandieiev, would you please inform us about the steps your ministry is taking? Welcome, dear colleagues. Indeed, the topic that has been announced for today's event is one of the topics that we are working on at the ministry, among other priorities. The event that has marked a decisive and irreversible step of Ukraine towards accession, the EU. The commitments that Ukraine has undertaken are also constituting a list of challenges, including the government bodies that are called to ensure the functioning of and realization and implementation of the necessary steps throughout the Ukrainian territory. Today, I would like to share with you a number of achievements in the context of the need of the Ukrainian population today. The Ukrainian Constitution, as you will have remembered, was adopted quite a long time ago. We celebrated the 25th anniversary last year when the independent Ukraine has adopted a new constitution. But there are a number of provisions in the text that perhaps were ignored and were not given an attention it deserves. I would like to mention a special article here, Article number 10 of the Ukrainian Constitution, that stipulates that the state encourages the mastering of the languages of international communication. What kind of political debacles we saw at that time? You remember the fight between the national democratic forces, and there was a compromise achieved. Given the context of the post-Soviet realities, there was a consensus achieved. Today, the situation is different, and we are called to read this article in accordance with the events taking place today, and perhaps what is more important, to read them in the context of the future. After the adoption of the Ukrainian Constitution and the adoption accordingly of the Article 10, there's one reference to that concept, the language of international communication. And of course, it was mentioned that English language takes the precedence. Why is it that we are talking about English language per se? Not because Ukraine is taking strides towards EU membership to be part and parcel of the international process, but because the mastering and knowledge of the English language is very important. I will brief you on the situation in the world in light of the challenges that we are seeing today. In order to implement and meet the challenges and tasks that will help the Ukrainian society to master the English language and grant the English language a higher status, the Ministry of Culture and Information Policy, at the request by the Prime Minister, has started to work and develop a law called the Law on Ensuring the Functioning of the English Language as the Language of International Communication. That will grant English language, as I mentioned, a status within the Article 10 of the Ukrainian Constitution. The foreign practices show that in spite of the fact that in many countries today and in many constitutions around the world, there is a definition of state official languages. Of course, they're different, but the English tongue is enjoying a very high status. For example, the latest data on Eurobarometer, English is the most widespread language as a foreign language in 19 out of 25 EU member states. We are not taking on board Ireland or Great Britain, the latter which is not EU member as of now. English language is enjoying the status of official language in the 60 countries in the world. De facto, English is official language in a number of other countries. For example, of course, we know Bangladesh, Cyprus, and other countries of the empire, but English, United Arab Emirates, etc. English language is a native language for almost 400 million people in the world and one of the 6 official languages of the United Nations Organization. English, of course, is the diplomatic language, one of the official language of the EU, European Commission, European Council, and the European Association of Businesses and NATO. English, of course, is the language of the international conferences and sports. The English language opens up a vista into the scientific language. Over the world, we are registering 800 million users of English. Millions of web pages are in English. 80% of the scientific works in the world have been authored in the English language. More than 1.5 billion people in the world are learning English. That is to say, learned by the people who are not native speakers. English is, and studying of English has been defined as one of the areas in the EU. So this is a point that impacts the foreign policy of this Ukraine and also adopting Ukrainian legislation towards the European legislation. According to the EU, multi-language ability of a person is one of the assets of the EU. That also applies for the Ukrainians. When we are well versed in English, we will be a part and parcel of the EU activities. One of the challenges of the EU is for every person to be versed not only in one foreign language, but at least in 2 foreign languages. As for the 2021, the English Proficiency Index that reflects the knowledge of English around the world, Ukraine belongs to the countries with an average knowledge of the English and is sitting at 0.40 out of 121 countries. That seems to be not a bad result. But remembering the fact that this survey was voluntary and every resident was free to participate or not, and of course people are given to overestimating their language abilities. I will remember a funny story when a person who is applying for a job asked whether he or she knows English, and the answer is yeah. Now the employer says, that's not English, that's German. The applicant says, well, it seems that I know not only German, but English too. So the objective assessment of your own knowledge is something that we're not given to. So real assessments are much worse, and we should be aware of that. Ukraine, unfortunately, is separated by EU and the rest of the world by the language barrier. The status of the English language will be that step that will be called to resolve the issue. This is a strategic course of Ukraine in general towards accession to the EU. The legislation that we have drawn up provides for the use of the English as a language of international communication in some public areas. For example, this will be guided by the international communication. Of course, the bill also defined the goal. To achieve these, there will be a number of steps taken. That is to say, the legislation is a declaration that is likely to become a declaration of the Ukrainian state towards the status of the English language and our vision for the future. But it is clear that a lot has to be done to achieve this. And this will be included in the operational plans by the ministry, etc. There are very fixed correlations between knowledge of English and the well-being of society, the ratio of GDP and other economic assessments and data. That seems to be self-evident, but when our work is beefed up by the economic research, then we know that some innovations have to be implemented. English language is one of those indices that will promote the market capability, promote international trade, and will also encompass the possibilities for every member of the Ukrainian public. The bill of the law, working on it, I've been talking to my colleagues in different ministries, and I hear the response that we should not be striving towards such high indexes of knowing the language. You know, our officers don't use English. What we need at this point in time is to understand that failure to use English, it's because we don't use English. But let us imagine a situation when a specialist, a public servant, or an officer at the local authority body in some, not in the capital city or not in the regions close to the border, will know English. That, we all understand, will promote his capabilities, abilities, and we are sure that this will also impact the decision-making process. We are now setting up intergovernmental body to agree different interests of the different stakeholders. We know it comes down to education, but the issue of usage is also interesting and important. Some things must be clearly defined in the laws and bylaws. We now have a draft legislation. I have it here available, but we are also understanding that the law in itself is not an official tool towards implementing specific things. That's why we are developing changes and amendments to other bylaws of Ukraine, including the law on the Ukrainian language as a state language. This is a very important point. I would like to emphasize that not a single provision in the law on the English language as a language of international communication, not a single provision cannot and will not target the narrowing of the space of the application of the Ukrainian language. Apart from the law on the application of the Ukrainian language, we believe a number of changes will be introduced into the laws on education, the law on public service. In an ideal world, we hope that will be implemented in the future, but we believe that every public servant will be efficient in English. The law enforcement officers that are dealing with the contacts with their colleagues abroad, of course, is very important, including the communications with the stateless persons. It can also be a point that when we talk about this public service, when you are addressed by foreigners in English, you're supposed to answer in English. In a year's time, and we look at the things in a cold light of day, it is not possible. We think there must be some time allocated for the level of mastering of the English language. Perhaps it'll take generations. We are aware of the international expertise. Sweden, for example, their language and law is called Scholar, and it provides that the English language is a compulsory language of education, and it was passed back in 1962. Well, you will understand that it was passed 6 decades ago, which meant that they had to prepare English language teachers, and the changes were initiated into the curricula. So Sweden doesn't have any language barriers in their communication with the world. Given that, Sweden is now sitting at point 12 in the assessments of the knowledge of the English language compared to those countries where English is not a native language, and that list is at the top of that list is the Netherlands. So we understand this is a complex process, remembering the lack of high qualified teachers. I was asking my colleagues at the Ministry of Education, asking them, how do you think we should increase the state order for the training of the English language teachers? The answer was, of course, the needs will grow as for the number of English language teachers. Perhaps there are a lot of schools where English was not the only foreign language study. I personally finished a secondary school where the one and the only foreign language was German. So I had a number of difficulties in adopting to the requirements for a public servant, so I had to take up studying English. You will know that in many educational establishments, apart from English, we also provide education in Spanish, German, and French. Of course, the area of application of English in the secondary schools is much bigger as compared to other foreign language. But going back to my conversation with the colleagues from the Ministry of Education, it's not the point that we don't have enough students at the pedagogical institutes or universities studying foreign or English language. The point is that upon graduation, they don't go to schools to teach. Now, the main point here is that we are spending a lot of money to prepare and train English language specialists, and the challenge is to get them to work in the schools, in the universities, for this law that we are discussing to be implemented. The changes, we think, will also bring changes in the laws, including the law on police of Ukraine. That provision will be included in that law as well. Apart from other commitments, there will be a point on knowledge of the English language. The law on, for example, foreign currency will also include point of language use. For example, a point will be made that an transaction that is done in the English language does not necessarily have to be translated into the Ukrainian, the state language. So we will have a situation where we will have parallel functioning of English and or Ukrainian. That is to say, there will be no problems for our public servants who are well versed in the English language. Another point in this area is the following. What will be the status of the Ukrainian language? As I mentioned, we don't foresee or insist on the narrowing of the application of the Ukrainian language. When the law on cinematography is passed, part of that is the use of the English language that is done in the original work must be translated into the Ukrainian language. This is the point where the market regulatory mechanisms will dictate if there is a need in the public to watch the movie in the original language, to appreciate the original and the culture of the movie. That possibility will be granted. Otherwise, there will be special requirements for the implementation of the law on Ukrainian language as a state language. That means that movies either will be dubbed or dubbed into Ukrainian or translated into that. And of course, it comes down to the radio broadcast. There are a number of provisions that call for the intrusion of the state. As I mentioned before, that means the regulation of the level of knowledge of English as a international communication means. It is important that we should enjoy that possibility not only in the training process. All of us here in the audience are past our school days. Some of us had English classes, and some of us have learned it. Other people are not that good. So we foresee some preferentials for the public servants who are studying English as a language of foreign communication. That will mean that interactive steps will take place, including applications that will be used in the modern means of communication. We would like to provide impetus in the law and bylaws for the people willing to and desiring to master English. There will be a number of competitions and so on. Of course, today we cannot say that the state will be engaged in those processes big time. It's a big ask for the future. Of course, the necessity of knowing the language for the officers in the central governmental and executive bodies is now very relevant. But in the future, that list will go down the authorities to the local administrations. We will be discussing those issues in the framework of our intergovernmental work. Of course, that bill will be submitted to the discussion in the parliament. We want to do this step by step to have some clear-cut priorities. First will be granted to those people who are communicating with the foreigners, and later on, perhaps not in 1 year's time or 2 years' time, say in a decade, the task will be for all public servants will be efficient in English. The main thing is to see clearly our goal, and then the practical steps will dictate how we will engage in that process, what kind of international aid we will need, and how much enthusiasm of the members of the public that will require. That, in a nutshell, is my message as for the law on ensuring the functioning of the English language as the language of international communication. Of course, I would like to touch upon other issues related to this opportunity. They deal with language, in particular with the English, with the Ukrainian language, the Ukrainian language, the cultural product that is produced in Ukrainian, including the books. There is information available now that the aggressor in the temporarily occupied territories wants to get rid of all the Ukrainian language books and throw them out of all the libraries in the temporarily occupied territories. Russia has always used the language issue as a weapon to take advantage of the controversies in the countries that they are interested in occupying and intruding culturally and invading culturally and impose culture, their culture and Russian language. Ukraine was, is, and will be fighting for the right to use the Ukrainian language as part of our identity and as a guarantee and a warranty to the functioning of the Ukrainian state. According to our data, as of now, more than 100 libraries have been destroyed in the occupied territories, and 221 were damaged, most of them in the Donetsk region, in the Kyiv region, in Kharkiv region. There have been 9 libraries destroyed. As for the cultural infrastructure, damaged have been 846 facilities of the cultural infrastructure. That is without the monuments. As of the late July, the number of facilities of cultural infrastructure, the number has grown 5-fold as compared to the beginning of the invasion. So what we see here is Russia has the task of obliterating the Ukrainian culture as part of the Ukrainian society's functioning. I would also like to share with you our research guided by the National Library named after Yaroslav Mudry. That's not only a library per se, it's a powerful research and scholarly center. They have conducted a research on a number of books used by potential readers in different libraries. Because of the full-scale aggression of the Russian Federation, as of June 2022, 100 libraries have lost a lion's share of their reserves, and a number of libraries have completely lost their book reserves, either as a result of shelling or fire. So here the Ukrainian authorities and the local authorities see a number of challenges for the Ukrainian public to meet the need of the Ukrainian language information. We would like to resolve this situation. Of course, it cannot be done in the blink of the eye, but we are working on the project called the National Digital Library, a new version of the Ukrainian law on libraries. It includes one of the toolkits as a digital literature to be available for the readers. We are also aware that such a format as a digital book is up to date, it's useful, it is important, it's user-friendly. We are also seeing the challenge of digitizing the books that are of cultural value or that are under the threat of being lost. We pray to God that these books should be preserved for the next generations in the digitized formats and forms. We are also aware that the need of the Ukrainian public for the Ukrainian book is not limited to the Ukrainian territory. A lot of Ukrainians were forced to flee the war to live in other foreign countries. That's why we have initiated something that is now taking place and is stepping up. The program called Books for Those Living Abroad. The target audience for this project are Ukrainians living abroad, especially children. This initiative has been supported by Olena Siporska, the First Lady of Ukraine, and such a patronage allowed us to successfully implement this kind of work. 160,000 copies of book have been published, and thus we are trying to supply and to address those communities, large or small Ukrainian societies that are using these books right now in the educational process or just for their social and cultural needs. We are thankful to our partners that have helped us on this road, and they are printing Ukrainian language books with their own resources, including Polish friends, and I would like to highlight the Education for Democracy initiative, other publishing houses, the Polish Book Institute, but our traditional friends, apart from the Polish friends, include our colleagues from Lithuania and Germany, the German Society of Book Retailers. We see the perspective of buying these books in Ukraine and sending them abroad. This is a complex project because the paper is expensive and is becoming more and more expensive because we see this shortage of paper throughout the world. This is where we have to focus on other formats of books, for example, audio books. This is an important project. We have been doing this at the request of the Ukrainian Publishing Association, and we are glad that there are a number of public organizations and societies that are actively engaged in these projects. And of course, they are doing this at the call of the heart. The last point that I would like to share with you is that the Ukrainian language today has acquired a more broad area of application throughout the world. Those people who cannot use it on a daily basis because of the Russian aggression have become Ukrainian language speakers, testifying to the fact that Ukraine is acquiring its own identity as a separate identity from the Russian world. Given that, the ministry, as I think every Ukrainian, welcomes all the initiatives for the Ukrainian language to be widespread. We also have to mention that the area of use of an application of the Russian language should not be limited to the point where the freedoms of the Ukrainians are breached. Of course, there are a lot of Ukrainians who are Russian language speakers, but we are also doing our best to make sure that Ukrainian language, in accordance with the Ukrainian law of the Ukrainian language and its function and application as a state language must be granted a possibility to be used throughout the Ukrainian territory. I am ready to answer your questions. Once you are interested in the statistical data that I have mentioned, I will be glad to share it with you after this press conference is over.
Дякую, Ростиславе.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Minister. Going back to the law on ensuring the functioning of the English language as the language of international communications, who were the stakeholders working on it, when this bill will be at the Parliament's reading? It was initiated by the Prime Minister, Mr. Shmyhal. By the way, tonight they're having a meeting on this particular issue, and the stakeholders will be participating in this meeting. This is a tool to implement a number of tasks. Apart from the law, a number of bylaws must be developed. A very powerful activity in this innovative work has been done by Ministry of Informational Transformation, and we are thankful to our partners, the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Justice. Currently, there is a clear understanding by the majority of the public that English must be promoted. Even those who are not well versed in the English language, they know how important this is. This is a part of the public awareness, and hopefully we will submit this bylaw for the consideration at the Parliament. Every misgivings about the law, that once the law has come into force, there will be a requirement for the English language to be used everywhere in the official documents. We know that public servants must know English. This law will regulate the level of knowledge, how that level of knowledge will be tested. Part of that, those requirements will be written by the Cabinet of Ministers. You will remember we made an attempt to prioritize the English language back in 2016. 2016, you will remember, was declared as an official year of the English language. The project did not get evolved. This time around, we think we will come up with a project that will be implemented. Tkachuk Svetlana at the Ukrinform Agency. I have a number of questions to you, and I will go one by one. The first question has to do with what you have already answered in part. In 2015 and 16, a number of steps were foreseen. How has the state reacted to this failure to institutionalize the English language in our public life? A number of English language, foreign language schools is growing. The pace is not that fast, but the dynamics is positive. The attention that the state pays to studying English in the secondary schools, meaning that a number of schools growing where the kids start learn English from grade 1. At the same time, all these possibilities are open to those willing to master English for their own purposes, to increase their competencies, for the people who are aware that they will increase their efficiency in the job market. We are not also increasing the rights, but also the requirements for the knowledge of English. Those people who were happy enough not to use English in their professional life. And I underscore the fact that it's about professional life, about the working relations. There were people who have been doing all right without knowing English, and they were quite proficient in their activities. But we know that spreading of the use of the resources available in the English language, this will impact your efficiency as a professional. And of course, there are situations when we are called to provide for a better communication with the world community. After the war is over, we will have more communications with the foreigners coming to Ukraine, and we must understand that these foreigners must feel comfortable here in Ukraine. They must be happy to come to Ukraine, invest money, make money here, and be well impressed by the Ukrainians. It's part of the cultural diplomacy, not abroad, but within Ukrainian cultural space. When you're talking to your counteragent or when you are talking to your Ukrainian partners, they want to appreciate the ability to communicate with the language English speakers in Ukraine. Of course, we realize that this process must be regulated, must be formalized, so that the government bodies and the self-government bodies must be represented by the officers that communicate in English well. We also understand the English language is part of the European integration. Do you think that this will lead to the Latinization of the Ukrainian language? We saw some discussion in the public area when we were talking about going from the Cyrillic to Latin alphabet. It's not about that. It is a matter of separating from the Russian language. That does not mean that we are likely to lose the values and the achievements of the thousands of years of the Ukrainian language in the Cyrillic alphabet. We are not talking about that in any sense. We are saying that the Ukrainian public must be well trained. The Ukrainian public must be people of Orthodox culture, that expands throughout the world. But if people know Chinese or other languages, it's all the more better. Do you have any more forecasts about how this law will impact the labor market? This is a very subjective point. It's not easy to analyze. We are taking aboard the foreign expertise. We are taking advantage of the practices and research done abroad. We have statistical data, and as I mentioned, that the level of being, the level of GDP, the income level is directly in a direct relation with the knowledge of the English language in the society. Thank you. Let me remind you that this press conference has been hosted by Rostyslav Karandieiev, the first Deputy Minister of Culture and Information Policy of Ukraine. The next press conference will take place at 13:30. We'll be talking about the situation in the Donetsk